story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Prasada and Rasanath.
Hi.
Hey, Michael.
Great to be with you guys, and thank you, everyone, for being with us today. This is the second episode of our little mini-series that we're doing on nonviolent communication, where we are talking about the key teachings of this framework and the teachings that have most affected us in our own lives and also in our coaching work. So on episode 1, we talked about needs versus strategies and what is a need, what is a strategy, and how we often conflate the two and how important it is to really be able to understand the difference. And today we are going to be talking about needs and emotions. And could you get us started by sharing what is this teaching?
Thank you, Michael. The word emotion is already revealing of something which is critical for us, but which often escapes us. And the way that the NVC framework terms it is feelings, actually. It's not spoken about as emotion, it's spoken about as feelings, typically. And what a feeling is an emotion. But so much of the time, when you ask somebody, how are you feeling? Because we don't often walk around saying, so what's your emotion, Michael? What's your emotion, Rasanath? We ask, how are you feeling? How do you feel about this? And we mistake our feelings for something other than our emotions. So the idea of distinguishing what are our feelings and what is the need behind our feelings is so critical in our lives. And NVC really illuminates this. And the connection between, this is very, very powerful to see the connection between our feelings and needs, that there is always a need behind every feeling. So when we're talking about a proper feeling, it is always because of a need that is either met or not being met. And the intensity of the emotion is due to the intensity of how well that need is being met or how poorly it's being met. So this is all to get clarity on what's going on in our inner world and why. What am I actually feeling? What is in my heart? As again, Marshall Rosenberg would ask, what's alive in you now? What's alive in you? It cannot be unemotional. It's not possible. You cannot be alive without your heart.
We spent a bunch of time in the first episode talking about how understanding needs versus strategies could lead us to communicate less violently or non-violently. And it would be great to set the stage here by doing a similar thing.
When they understand needs, what is also important is to ask the question, well, whose needs are those? And the answer very obviously is they are my needs. And many times when our needs are not met, there is a very subtle shift, but a very powerful shift in the responsibility of whose needs are those. So suddenly what happens when I articulate my needs, in the articulation, what is also important in the articulation is they are my needs, which means I am solely responsible for them. So how it leads to less violent communication is the ownership of it. And one of the things that NVC teaches is that your needs are yours, and nobody is responsible for meeting those needs. We can ask for help, but the needs are ours.
The beauty of the framework is that I get so much clarity about all the stuff that's swimming around inside me that I usually pay very little attention to. It just sort of acts on me and governs me, but I don't really know how to make sense of it. And I don't make the time to make sense of it. I don't have the tools to make sense of it. And here it's like, you have to make the time. Here are the tools. It's very clear, very simple, and it just clears the fog. And so then when you're having a conversation with somebody else, it's not like, yeah, I just don't feel good about what you're saying. That just doesn't feel good to me. Or the sort of general way we communicate where we're missing each other because we're not in touch with ourselves. So how could we be in touch with the other person? We're just sort of like having our stories fly around that I don't like the way that you're acting. Wait a minute. What is the feeling that I have that's causing me to say that? And what's the need that's not being met? And then how do I see that that's not that person's responsibility? This is a universal need that can be met in so many ways. Why am I fixated on this person meeting it in this way? Here, it's on a silver platter. This is how you can get in touch with yourself. What's the feeling? What's the need? It's that simple.
This is great. Thank you both for that. So let's look at a general example where I think we can all relate to this one in some aspect of our lives. Maybe it's at work or maybe it's at home, but you'll hear a lot of people say, I feel like this person doesn't care about me. They never care about me. And I'm frustrated. How can we use this framework? And if we want to workshop it, if you want to treat me as the client here, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if I were coaching you, I would ask you, what is the emotion there? You're saying you're feeling this, but that's not an emotion. And this is typically what people will bring up. When I've asked clients, especially, what are you feeling? It's things like what you said. They're stories, basically. They're stories. And sometimes it's like a gut feeling or a perception or an insight or something that's even connected to the heart, which is important. And the stories are also important to unpack. But it's not what I'm asking for. What are you feeling? I mean, I want to know those things. But if you can't tell me what's the emotion that you're feeling, then that shows the disconnect. And then how are you going to be trustworthy in engaging with somebody else when you're disconnected from yourself? So I would ask you, what are you actually feeling? What's the emotion?
Yeah, this is great. So when I say I'm feeling like he doesn't care about me, that's not a feeling, right? There's a lot of, maybe our listeners have seen feeling wheels or lists of feelings. There's no feeling of this person isn't listening to me. That's an interpretation of the interaction between myself and the other person.
Yeah. And again, having a sense of something, especially if you're really in touch with yourself, that can be powerful. And that can be a feeling in a different way. But that's not the feeling we're talking about here. The feeling we're talking about is, what is the emotion? And if you can't tell me, I can't emphasize this enough, if you can't tell me what is the emotion, and if you can't tell me what is the need behind the emotion, then it's going to be really hard to trust the sense behind all of that, or the sense that you're leading with.
So the feeling there might be a sense of helplessness, a feeling of helplessness, or a feeling of sadness. This relationship is not actually working out as I would have hoped.
Or a feeling of shame that I was hoping that this person would be a better representative of me. And when you said that this person is not, I feel so frustrated that this person is not listening to me. Because only if the person listened to me will then they become what I would want for them to become, which means that they are a proper representative of who I think I am, right? There are layers here. And if we follow the rabbit hole, we will begin to see that it leads right back to us.
Well, also, It can be as easy as just, Rasanath, you used the word frustrated. That's an emotion. That's a feeling proper. So that may be the easiest beginning. And then you might see behind the frustration is actually shame. Behind the shame, there's some fear of not being seen in a certain way. Right. So as you said, there are these layers, and we want to capture all of that. But a great starting point is, oh, feels to me like there's some frustration, or I'm sensing some frustration there. And if the person says, yeah, it's really frustrating, great, you've hit on it. You've hit on a feeling. Then what's behind that? And this is actually operationalizing everything to make it constructive, because the default is not that. The default is the ego just wants to be seen as who I think I should be. And the world is hardly ever giving me that consistently. And even when it is, that can change at any moment. So there's the fear that that will inevitably happen, and it will keep happening. So there's all of this like selfish and unconstructive energy that we can peel off and clear away if we just get in touch with, hey, you have a right to this feeling. This is real. You're feeling this way. I want to understand that. I empathize with that. And then what's behind it? Okay, so then how would you want to get that need met in a different way? Now it's constructive. Now it's operationalized rather than just complaining, gossiping, wallowing in my own upsetness, venting. That's most of our time and energy is just leaking out. But here we have a way of saying, I'm going to pinpoint what's going on inside, and I'm going to do something with it.
So the first thing you did there was to acknowledge that this person, me in this case, is feeling some frustration, which was, even though this is not a real example, I still felt some relief of like, oh, you've seen me for what I'm going through. I was also sharing with you guys that I'm always, before we were recording this, always a little suspicious when people say I'm frustrated and that's the emotion that I'm feeling, because there's often, as we've identified, other emotions, which might be deeper emotions that are underneath the frustration, something like shame, that can be even more helpful than just stopping at frustration to really get in touch with. And then once we've gotten in touch with the emotion, then there are needs that we can identify, which can help us even have more empathy. So in this case, when I'm talking about feeling frustrated because somebody's not caring for me, I have a need for care. I have a need to be heard. And those are universal needs.
You suddenly become clearly human, and someone else can relate to you as such. And you can relate to other people and what they're going through in a different way. You become vulnerable and you become authentic.
So I can imagine one of the pushbacks would be like, if the other person is doing something wrong to me, why should I be vulnerable? Then I'm just opening myself up. Like if the person is talking down to me, am I really going to say, oh yeah, I have a need to be heard, when they're already talking down to me? And now I'm putting myself in an even more vulnerable position than what I felt.
Well, Marshall Rosenberg was quite expert at dealing with these things. As the founder of NVC, he would put people in the most inconceivable situations into dialogue with each other, like the murderer of another person's family, like as extreme and horrific as you can imagine. He would sit them down together, and he would somehow be able to work magic by getting them to empathize with each other using this framework. I am not so expert. I don't have that magic. I wouldn't do that. I see also a place for boundaries here. And I think he would also acknowledge a need for boundaries. So if these people are not willing to come together, or if there's a chance that there could be further damage as a result, don't do it. Don't make yourself vulnerable. And I'm very careful about this, because I see how you make yourself vulnerable once, and you're not received for it, you never want to do it again. What to speak of if somebody actually exploits your vulnerability? Forget it. That becomes a scar. So we have to be careful with that. At the same time, you see some potential and you're willing to take a step, be courageous and invite the other person into a safe space, but set the ground rules. There have to be agreements so that it's genuinely a safe space to explore, even if the conversation is difficult and even if the other person really caused harm.
The only thing I wanted to distinguish here is the difference between vulnerability and then being harmed for being vulnerable. And the reason why that distinction is important is we are vulnerable. The fact that we have needs, this is why we don't necessarily, why is it, it's so hard to one, talk about needs or to speak of even identify them, is because when we identify our needs, we actually feel vulnerable. We feel dependent. We can't necessarily free ourselves from that dependency. So very fundamentally, when we talk about needs, it brings us in touch with our vulnerability. Now, the strategy is, should I express my needs to this person or not? Will I be received? It's not even meeting of the needs as much as will this be received or not is a judgment call that we need to make, which is where a prudence is necessary, because sometimes you can express your need and not be received, or even worse, being exploited, which then makes it very hard in the future to even acknowledge my own needs or express it to anybody, even people who will or who are in a place to be able to receive me. So the reason why that is important to bring up is many times we might say, I don't want to make myself vulnerable. We are vulnerable because we have needs. And then we have to decide on where will that vulnerability be received and where will it not be received or perhaps even be exploited.
Needs make us feel needy, as we talked about last time. Yeah, this is a great point about it being our judgment call about whether to actually share that and with whom to share it. But the key thing is we skip a step here, which is doing this work with ourselves.
That's right. That's it.
That already solves so much. Sometimes that's the end point, is just I've worked it out for myself or I've worked it out with somebody else is often the case, is often really important, that I have somebody else who understands me, who empathizes with me, and who has a healing effect by getting me more in touch with myself and seeing me for who I am. Then I don't need to necessarily play it out in the relationship where the need is not being met or even where the damage has been done.
Which also underscores the importance of coaching as we define it at Upbuild. Coaching is having a mirror that reflects back. And so when you have that mirror who can help identify the needs and work it out, as Hari Prasad said, then it also shifts the weight on the relationship which is being worked on.
Just to go back to what Rasanath you were sharing earlier around doing this work ourselves and then making a judgment call around whether to share it with somebody else. There was something that you shared with me many months ago that when I was working on a difficult relationship that I was having, which really stands out to me and something that I feel inspired to share now, which is that when we're seeking understanding from somebody else or we're having conflict with somebody else because we feel not understood, the most satisfying thing would be to get that understanding from the other person. But if that's not possible for whatever reason, the next best thing is then to seek that understanding from somebody else. Even if it's not going to be as satisfying, it still can be satisfying enough that it gives us some placeholder.
Yeah, this is something that I have personally experienced. And in, to underscore what you said, if we were to orient ourselves in all of our relationships as, well, what can I do to serve that relationship in the best possible way? Then one thing is, especially in close relationships, when we don't feel understood, and even more so, we don't know if there will be a time when we will be understood. Getting the understanding releases the time pressure on the other relationship. And what then you give space for, and many times the intensity with which we seek the understanding is what comes in the way of receiving it. Right? The intensity, like I want it now. Okay, how much more time do you need to give me the understanding? Like 5 years, 10 years, and the challenge is that when the other person is on their own journey, their own trajectory, there is no timeline that really defines it.
Any other examples that either of you would share about how we could use this framework of thinking about needs that are connected to emotions?
Yeah, I was reflecting on a coaching relationship, many coaching relationships, but there was one that came up in particular where there was a founder who felt really humiliated that she was disrespected by people in her field. And it happened on multiple occasions. And she was very, very torn up about it. She was super emotional. And I was really affected by what she was going through. And my main motivation was to really convey empathy to her, to give her the experience of being empathized with. And it's much more straightforward, and it's so helpful when you can understand, okay, so what you're feeling is humiliation. What you're feeling is sorrow. What you're feeling is anger. And why? There's a need behind it. So in this case, there was a need to be respected. There was a need to be seen. And there's also a need for contribution. And she was feeling like all of that had been stripped from her. Now, had all of those things actually been stripped from her? Not exactly, because no one can take those things away from us, but they can make us go through the experience as if that's what's happened. And that brings up all of these emotions. And when you can pinpoint again the need behind it, you can provide so much more empathy and clarity. And so in this case with this founder, I just sat with her in that space and I connected her to the feeling and to those needs. And I felt a profound sense of connection with her and a healing effect from that. And yeah, for me, it was very moving. It was very emotional. So I find that using this for providing empathy is one of the most profound things we can do. And that's empathy for others, but it's also empathy for ourselves. If we can't do this for ourselves, we're going to be pretty inept at doing this for other people.
Beautiful, beautiful example. I'm smiling internally and actually a little bit externally now, just thinking about this experience that you must have had with her, and also how she must have been affected by your presence and what you were able to see and draw out from her. And I appreciate that point a lot around those things were not completely stripped of her. But we don't need to convince others that those needs are still being met. We can see how they're not being met in some ways. And that critical piece of empathy, which you may not have been in that same exact situation. So you couldn't put yourself exactly in the shoes that she was in, but you do understand the need for respect. You do understand the need to be seen and for contribution. Those are universal needs, as we talked about. All the needs that we're speaking about here through the NVC lens are universal human needs. And when we connect through that lens of something that we have experienced and the needs that we also have, that empathy is much more powerful.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's typical that we jump into strategizing mode. That's sort of our default reaction. And that's not necessarily the best reaction. In fact, if we're jumping into it, it's often like we're skipping steps. First, we need self-empathy and clarity. And sometimes it can end there or just stay there for quite some time before we go into strategizing. And in this case, I could see that strategizing about how to get these needs met or how to rectify the relationships that were not meeting those needs, neither of them, neither finding alternative means to meet those needs nor rectifying the unmetness in the relationships that were there, were really the need of the hour. That really we had to honor the emotions and we had to honor the unmet needs. And I mean, this is well documented now that actually empathy is the most healing force. It's the best thing that you can do. And then strategies are like a bonus. They can be, I mean, they're important and we need them and they can be super helpful.
Is there anything else that either of you would like to share before we close?
This is hard work. And many times when people say that, well, I want to grow, I'm so invested in my personal growth. And when I have introductory conversations with clients, you can actually see I want to grow. People use the phrase, I want to land my plane, and it's nice to see that excitement. And at the same time, I internally just think about it. Well, if I were to tell you what it will take to actually land the plane, you might not do this. It's hard work. And as we hear this content coming in touch with our needs, it's easy to dismiss this as, well, that's just the soft stuff. I'm actually looking for solutions. I'm looking for tactics. And our tactics don't necessarily work. There are no shortcuts in this. Real growth has no shortcuts. And to me, the nonviolent communication framework, repeatedly, you have to go back to understanding and owning what are my needs and feeling that I'm solely responsible for it. Right? And that is just relentless hard work, which is what growth is all about. But it's very satisfying when we learn how to create that habit. We will find how freeing and how satisfying it is.
Rasanath, I'm feeling very called out right now because before I ask the question, is there anything that you would share in closing? The other question that I was about to ask was, okay, so great, this is all wonderful, but what are the practical things that we could do now to take away with us? How do we land this plane now that we have this information? And I'm glad I did not ask that question, but it certainly was a temptation. And I appreciate this point a lot. First of all, bringing gravitas to what we're doing here, and actually a lot of empathy, because we're talking about this stuff, and yet it's, if we were really to put it into practice in our lives, it's a major thing. It's not a small thing. And just to know and to say that out loud, I think is very helpful for me and also hopefully for our audience.
Well, it's funny because I wanted to share something in closing that I really hope our listeners will take away, just bringing it to a fine point. And the context here is that most of us, as we've been talking about, are not connected to our feelings or our needs. We don't create that time. We don't create that self-connection. And therefore, how can we expect to be satisfied in our relationship with ourselves or in our relationships with others? So that's really necessary. And many times I have used this framework to help people that don't even know where to begin in getting in touch with their hearts. So again, with Marshall Rosenberg talking about what's alive in you, if we can't feel what's going on in our hearts, or we just can't make any sense of it, then we're not in touch with our aliveness. So I've worked with many people who just don't know where to begin. How do I access my heart? I'm so used to shutting it off because I don't want to feel the shame. I don't want to feel all of the complexity of emotions. I don't have time to do it. I just need to be productive, or I just need to survive my day, or I just need to kill it at work. I need to do this. I need to do that. I need to take care of my kids, right? It doesn't take that long to get in touch with your heart, especially if you become, as you said, practiced, if you make this a practice. So this is what I ask of people. Make self-connection a practice. And self-connection is really most fundamentally served by self-empathy. How do we create self-empathy? Figure out, what am I feeling right now? And what is the need behind that feeling? And give yourself the chance to feel for yourself. It's really that simple. If you just do that one thing, if you do it once a day, even, of course, we want to do this all the time. We want to be in touch with ourselves all the time. But start by doing it once a day. What am I feeling right now? What is the need behind that feeling? And allow myself to feel that feeling, feel what it's like to have the need not met, or what it would be like to have it met if it's not met, and how difficult it is to not have it met. Feel for yourself. Self-empathy creates self-connection, which creates connection with other people. This is the transformation. So that's what I would ask of everyone.
Very good. Super clear. So the question, what am I feeling right now? And what is the need that is connected to this feeling? Thank you both for being with me for episode number 2 of this little mini series on nonviolent communication. And I look forward to being back with you for the 3rd episode.
Same.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care, guys. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.